If you work as a manufacturing facilities engineer, installing a new piece of equipment can be as complex as the machinery itself. From prep work to alignment and testing, it's your team's job to put it all together. That's why it's good to have Grainger on your side. With industrial-grade products and next-day delivery, Grainger helps ensure you have everything you need close at hand through every step of the installation. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I am your host, guiding you through cases that have passed through the courts but left the public divided. These aren't your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts might be clear, but the truth? Well, that's another story. Here, we're going to dive into a case that questions the very foundations of criminal responsibility. It's a case that forces us to ask, when someone commits a terrible crime, but their mental state is in question, how much can we hold them accountable? In Kahler versus Kansas, James Kahler was convicted of the brutal murder of his wife, his 2 daughters, and his mother-in-law. The crime shocked everyone, but what followed was a legal battle over whether Kansas's unique laws on mental illness and culpability violated his rights. Kansas doesn't allow the traditional insanity defense, and so the courts faced a tough question. Was Kahler mentally ill to the point that he couldn't understand his actions, or was he fully aware and responsible for his horrific crime? This is the heart of the debate here. Was James Kahler truly mad? Or is this case where the law saw through the defense of insanity and held him accountable for his actions? As always, you're going to have the chance to weigh the evidence, the arguments, and of course, the public's perception. So listen closely as we unravel the facts and explore the tough questions around mental health and criminal responsibility. Starting right now in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion, we ask, James Kahler, mad or bad? The case of James Kahler is one that digs into the heart of criminal responsibility, mental illness, and the law's role in navigating the two. On Thanksgiving weekend back in 2009, Kahler shot and killed 4 members of his family, his wife, 2 daughters, and mother-in-law. The details of the crime were horrific, and the public was left stunned by the brutality. But as the case unfolded, another layer of complexity emerged: Kahler's mental state. Kahler's defense argued that he had been suffering from severe depression and other mental health issues, which clouded his judgment and pushed him into a downward spiral. They claimed that at the time of the murders, Kahler was so disconnected from reality that he couldn't fully understand the consequences of his actions. Under normal circumstances, this might have led to an insanity defense. However, Kansas does not allow for the traditional insanity defense, meaning that Kahler couldn't argue that he wasn't guilty by reason of insanity. Instead, the court focused on a much narrower question. Did Kahler understand what he was doing was wrong? Kansas law only allows defendants to argue that they didn't have the mental capacity to form mens rea, the intent or knowledge of wrongdoing. If Kahler knew that killing his family was wrong, even if he was mentally ill, he could be held accountable fully. So here's the question. Was Kahler's mental illness enough to absolve him of responsibility for his actions? Did his psychological state make him incapable of controlling himself? Or did he know what he was doing and simply choose to act out of anger and revenge? This is where the legal system and the public opinion often clash. Mental illness complicates our understanding of accountability. We don't understand all of it. But should it change how we view justice? Well, by the end of this episode, I'll be asking you to decide, did the courts get it right? Or was Kahler's mental state overlooked in the rush to convict him of a heinous crime? James Kahler's life seemed like that of any successful man. He had built a career as a city utilities director, providing a stable life for his family. He was respected in his community and had what many would consider a typical middle class life. But beneath the surface, things were not as stable as they appeared. In the years leading up to the crime, Kahler's life began to unravel. His marriage to his wife, Karen, became strained after years of conflict. That's when she filed for divorce. And for Kahler, the breakdown of his marriage was devastating. And he reportedly struggled to cope with the reality of losing his family. At the same time, his mental health took a significant downturn, with signs of depression becoming increasingly clear to those around him. He began withdrawing from friends and family, and his behavior became more erratic. In 2009, after the divorce proceedings were underway, Kahler lost his job as the utilities director, further adding to his emotional and financial stress. His mental health continued to deteriorate, and despite clear signs of his deepening depression, Kahler refused to seek help. His family members later testified that they had tried to encourage him to get treatment, but he rejected the whole idea, claiming it wasn't necessary. His refusal to address his mental health concerns would soon have tragic consequences. On Thanksgiving weekend of 2009, Kahler travels to his estranged wife's family home, like I said, in Kansas. He's armed with a rifle. He entered the home where his wife, two teenage daughters, and his mother-in-law were staying, and what followed was a horrific scene. Kahler shot and killed all four women in cold blood. His son, he was present at the time, was the only survivor, spared by Kahler in an act that would later become a key part of the prosecution's argument against him. The murders shocked the local community and made headlines across the country. A man who had once seemed like a regular family man had committed an unspeakable crime, leaving many to wonder what had driven him to such a horrific act. The focus quickly shifted from the crime itself to his mental state. His defense team argued that he had been suffering from severe mental health issues, including depression, which had clouded his judgment and left him incapable of controlling his actions. However, Kansas law would complicate his defense by not accepting that traditional insanity defense. As the investigation into the murders unfolded, James Kahler's mental state became a focal point of the case. Friends and family painted a picture of a man who had once been successful, but was now unraveling under the pressure of his deteriorating mental health, personal life, and career. His relationship with Karen had been turbulent in the years leading up to the murders, with reports of emotional abuse and controlling behavior on Kahler's part. Karen had initiated divorce proceedings, taking their children and seeking a new life away from him. To Kahler, the divorce marked the destruction of his family, and this was a loss he could not accept. In the months leading up to the murders, Kahler's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Family members recalled instances where he seemed disconnected from reality, prone to angry outbursts, deep withdrawal, and obsessive fixation on Karen's decision to leave him. His friends and colleagues noticed the changes in him, and some urged him to seek therapy. But despite these warnings, he never did pursue mental health treatment, and he only continued to spiral downwards. Then comes that Thanksgiving weekend in 2009. It was a turning point. Kahler, devastated by the prospect of spending a holiday away from his children, drives over to his in-laws' home. And there, armed with a rifle, Kahler confronted his estranged wife and children. In a fit of rage, he opens fire. His two teenage daughters, Lauren and Emily, were shot killed, as was his wife, Karen, and his mother-in-law, Dorothy White. His young son Sean survives the attack, a fact that Kahler's defense later used to argue that Kahler had been so mentally disturbed that he couldn't have been acting with clear intent. However, the prosecution saw Sean's survival as a clear sign that Kahler had been in control enough to decide who lived and who died. Kahler was arrested shortly after the murders, and he confessed to the killings. Yet his defense argued that his confession was further proof of his disconnection from reality. He admitted to the crime without emotion, seemingly detached from the horror of what he had done. They painted a picture of a man driven to the edge by depression and mental illness, claiming that Kahler's actions were the result of a severe psychological breakdown. But under that Kansas law, no traditional insanity defense, not available to Kahler. They don't allow that. Kansas only allows a mens rea defense, meaning the court was only required to determine whether Kahler knew that his actions, shooting and killing 4 people, were legally wrong. As the trial approached, the defense team was left with a narrow path forward. They needed to prove that Kahler's mental illness was so severe that he could not form the necessary intent to commit murder. This put Kahler's mental state at the center of the trial. As the defense sought to show his actions, while undeniably horrific, were the result of a mind disconnected from reality. Meanwhile, the prosecution took a starkly different approach. They acknowledged that Kahler had mental health issues, but argued he was still fully aware of what he was doing. They pointed to the planning involved, Kahler driving to the scene armed with a weapon and sparing his son, as evidence that Kahler had acted with intent. His actions were not the result of a spontaneous breakdown, they argued, but a calculated decision to exact revenge on his family for the dissolution of his marriage. In the end, the court had to grapple with these 2 competing narratives. Was Kahler a man so consumed by mental illness that he could not control his actions? Or was he fully aware of what he was doing and responsible for the brutal deaths of his family members? As the trial began, the courtroom became a battleground over one central question. Was James Kahler fully responsible for his actions? Or did his mental illness absolve him of some or not all of the guilt? The defense and the prosecution presented starkly different views of Kahler's state of mind leading up to and during the crime. The defense argued that Kahler's mental illness had rendered him incapable of forming the necessary intent to commit premeditated murder. They brought in expert witnesses, psychologists and psychiatrists, who testified that Kahler had been suffering from a severe depressive disorder. According to these experts, his depression had not only clouded his judgment, but had driven him to a state of extreme emotional distress. In their view, Kahler's mind was so overwhelmed by his mental illness that he could not fully comprehend or control his actions on that night of the murders. They emphasized that in the months leading up to the killings, Kahler's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He'd isolated himself from family and friends, exhibited extreme mood swings, and obsessed over the breakdown of his marriage. His refusal to seek treatment, the defense argued, that was not a sign of control, but a symptom of his declining mental state. They portrayed him as a man on the edge, emotionally and psychologically unraveling under the weight of his personal crisis. And furthermore, they pointed to the fact that Kahler had spared his son, Sean, during the attack, and said this was proof that his actions were not entirely calculated or malicious. In their narrative, this showed that Kahler's judgment was impaired. He was acting impulsively, driven by a mind in chaos and unable to form the intent that was necessary for first-degree murder. They argued that under normal circumstances, he might not have been found guilty by reason of insanity if Kansas law allowed for that. But Kansas does not. So instead, the jury was instructed to focus solely on whether Kahler understood that his actions were wrong in the legal sense. Did he know as he pulled the trigger that killing his family was against the law, that it was illegal? The defense argued that Kahler's mental state was so impaired that he could not make that distinction at the time of the crime. The prosecution, though, took a very different approach, focusing on the details of the crime and what they believed was clear evidence of premeditation. From their perspective, Kahler was not a man out of control, but a man driven by rage and a desire for revenge against his wife for leaving him. The fact that he brought a rifle to his estranged wife's family home, they argued, was proof that Kahler had planned the attack. He didn't simply lose control in the heat of a moment. He made a deliberate decision to kill. The prosecution also dismissed the idea that Kahler's mental illness absolved him of guilt. They acknowledged that he had been suffering from depression, but they pointed out that many people with mental health issues do not commit violent crimes. This is true. Kahler's depression, they argued, did not prevent him from understanding that his actions were wrong. In fact, they argued that his sparing of Sean was a clear indication that Kahler knew exactly what he was doing. He had chosen to let one family member live, while deliberately killing all the others, a decision that demonstrated intent and control. The prosecution leaned heavily on Kansas's legal standard, which doesn't allow defendants to argue they were incapable of understanding the moral wrongness of their actions. The question before the jury was simple. Did James Kahler know murder was illegal? That's really all they needed to know. And if he did, then under Kansas law, this guy was guilty, regardless of any mental health issues. In their closing arguments, the prosecution painted a picture of a man who had become consumed by anger and frustration over his crumbling life. Kahler's depression, they argued, was not the cause of his actions, but a backdrop to a deeper issue: his desire to regain control over his family through violence. They framed the murders as an act of revenge, a calculated decision made by a man who wanted to punish his wife because she left him. For the jury, the decision came down to whether they believed that Kahler's mental illness was so severe that he couldn't understand the wrongness of his actions, or whether his actions were deliberate and calculated, driven by a desire for revenge. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution, finding Kahler guilty of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death. But the case didn't end there. Kahler's legal team appealed the decision, arguing that Kansas's refusal to allow a traditional insanity defense violated his rights, his constitutional rights. The case made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the central question became whether Kansas's narrow definition of the insanity defense was constitutional. The conviction and sentencing of James Kahler sparked a significant legal debate, particularly regarding Kansas's strict laws on the insanity defense. While most states allow defendants to argue that severe mental illness can absolve them of criminal responsibility, Kansas, along with a few other states, operates under a much narrower definition. In Kansas, the question isn't whether the defendant is mentally ill to the point that they can't distinguish right from wrong in a moral sense. It's only if they understand that their actions were illegal. For many legal experts and mental health advocates, this approach is too restrictive. They argue that Kansas's mens rea standard overlooks the deeper psychological issues of severe mental illness. In Kahler's case, the defense team insisted that his severe depression and emotional breakdown left him incapable of fully understanding or controlling his actions. According to this view, the law in Kansas fails to account for the reality that mental illness can so distort a person's thinking that they may not be fully responsible for their actions. On the other side of the debate are those who argue that mental illness should not be used as an excuse for committing violent crimes. The state of Kansas, backed by its laws, takes the position that individuals who commit heinous acts should be held accountable if they understand what they are doing is illegal, regardless of their mental state. Because to them, allowing a broad insanity defense opens the door to dangerous precedents, where criminals could potentially evade responsibility simply by claiming mental illness after the fact. This case made it to the U.S. Supreme Court in Kahler versus Kansas, where the justices had to decide whether Kansas's narrow approach to the insanity defense violated the U.S. Constitution. The Supreme Court's eventual ruling upheld Kansas's law, reaffirming the state's right to limit the insanity defense. According to the court, states have the authority to define the parameters of criminal responsibility and the insanity defense as they see fit. But the ruling here did not put an end to the controversy. Many mental health advocates and legal scholars continue to criticize Kansas's approach, arguing it ignores the complexities of mental illness and it unfairly punishes individuals who may not have been fully aware of their actions. They point out that in states with more traditional insanity defenses, Kahler might have not been found guilty, and it might have been by reason of insanity, or at least maybe spared the death penalty. This case here has become a symbol of the larger debate at hand about how the legal system should handle cases involving mental illness. Should the law take into account the moral capacity of the defendant? Or really, is it enough just that the defendant knew their actions were legal regardless of their mental state? For the public, this case continues to raise uncomfortable questions about that line between mental illness and criminal responsibility. Public opinion in cases like Kahler's tends to be split. On one side, there are those who sympathize with Kahler, seeing him as a man who was undone by his mental illness and shouldn't be held fully responsible for the murders. They point out the mounting evidence of his psychological breakdown and the fact that he had no previous history of violence or criminal behavior. They don't feel it's in his nature. To these people, Kahler is not so much a cold-blooded killer, but a tragic figure, someone whose mind betrayed him, leading to an act he might not have committed if he had been mentally well. And on the other side, there are those who believe that mental illness, while tragic, cannot excuse such an egregious crime. They argue that Kahler made a conscious choice that day to take his wife's life and the lives of his children and mother-in-law, and that sparing his son showed he was in control enough to make a decision about who could live and who had to die. For this group, the law is clear. Kahler understood that murder was wrong and that it was illegal, and he acted with intent, and this would make him fully responsible for his actions. The case of James Kahler, it forces us to try to understand the reality that mental illness absolutely can complicate our understanding of justice. But in Kansas, where the law is clear, the jury had little room, less room than some other places, to consider these complexities. Kahler's fate was sealed the moment the court ruled that he understood the legal consequences of his actions, regardless of his mental state. Yet the legacy of the case continues to spark debate about how we define accountability and whether states like Kansas should broaden their definitions of insanity so as to better reflect those complexities that are a part of mental health. As we come to the end of this case, we're left with a complex question. Was James Kahler truly responsible for his actions, these murders of his entire family? Or was his mind so consumed by mental illness that he couldn't fully understand what he was doing and otherwise would never have done such a horrifying act? The courts, guided by Kansas law, ultimately determined that Kahler knew that murder was illegal, and that was enough to convict him. But does this approach to justice fully capture the nuances of mental illness? For some, the idea that Kahler could be held responsible despite his severe mental health issues, it seems too harsh, an oversimplification of what it means to be mad or bad. They argue that Kansas law ignores the reality that mental illness can distort a person's thinking, and it can do so profoundly that they lose control over their actions. Could Kahler, in his deep depression, have been so far removed from rational thought that he acted without true understanding of what he was doing? Then, on the other hand, many believe that mental illness just does not and should not absolve anyone from committing a crime like this. In their view, Kahler's actions were deliberate, and they were driven by anger and a desire for control, mentally ill or not. They argue mental illness is not a free pass and that accountability is crucial, especially in cases involving such horrific violence. If Kahler knew what he was doing was illegal, isn't that enough for him to be held fully responsible? This case, like so many others we've covered, it requires us as a people to confront the difficult intersection of mental health and criminal justice. The law doesn't allow for gray areas. The law is the law. But the human mind is far more complex. There is no one way or the other. So now it is your turn to decide. Do you believe the courts got it right? Should Kansas's strict laws on the insanity defense be reevaluated to account for severe mental illness? Or is the current system the best way to ensure justice is served? The courts have made their ruling, but what about you? Were James Kahler's actions the result of a broken mind, or was he fully in control of what he did? Could this have been a case of madness, or simply a man making a calculated, terrible decision? Think about it. Thank you for joining me on another case in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay out of trouble and stay curious. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.